my first guest tonight, who hasn't put a foot wrong on air in his entire career. He has brought the news to us for almost 4 decades. He's been a constant in a world turned upside down. And today, he became the news himself when he signed off for the very last time after 37 years. We are sorry to see him go, but we are delighted that he's agreed to one last bulletin tonight with us. Would you please welcome Bryan Dobson! Welcome to the show. Welcome to the show. I hope you're feeling the love. You brought the news into so many homes for so many years. What did it finally feel like today to sign off for the final time? Has it sunk in?
I don't think it has yet, Patrick. No, and I think that might take a little while. Somebody said, "Will you feel it on Monday?" And I said, "Well, that's a bank holiday, so I might be off anyway." And
we'll all feel it on Monday.
So I'm not sure when it'll sink in. I decided myself to retire a bit early, so I picked my date, which was now, which is the start of the summer, because I thought it's a lot nicer to retire into the summer than to wait to the winter and be facing those short, dark, wet days. So I think the summer will take care of itself, and then we'll see. I think September, October, that's when I'll really begin to realise this decision I've taken.
The decision you've taken. I mean, we all know that news is all about facts. It's not about emotion. Was there any point today for you when those two things were starting to mix, probably for the first time?
Well, yeah, I suppose when I started to talk about my colleagues and how important they are to me and how important the news team is in broadcasting, because it's not a one-man or a one-person operation by any means, and I've had great colleagues, and I'll miss them terribly. I really value their companionship, their friendship, their great advice, their support through all the years. And a newsroom is, I think, a wonderfully exciting and stimulating environment to operate in, because there's lots of people with lots of opinions, and they're quite prepared to share them with you at some length, actually, if you...
Whether you want them or not.
Exactly. So, but it's a unique kind of workplace, and I think that'll definitely take a bit of adjusting. Yeah.
37 years here at RTE. Mm-hmm. Not bad for someone who... I'm not sure if you know this, originally blacklisted.
Oh, yes. Yes,
This is...
Yeah. I was, I'm told, on an RTE blacklist.
Yes.
And it happened as follows.
There's a few people on that, to be fair.
I did get off it eventually, obviously. I began my broadcasting in pirate radio. Now, people my age and generation probably might remember pirate radio, and maybe even some of you are a little younger as well. So that's why I started broadcasting, because that was where there was an opportunity. But I was headhunted by a producer in RTE to go and be interviewed as a possible reporter for RTE.
There he is. Yeah. Look at this handsome man here.
And in I came, I was interviewed and so on, and I got a call from the editor who was managing all this, a man called Leo Enright, and Leo called me to say, well, there's good news and there's bad news. I said, well, OK, what's that? He said, well, the good news is you've got the job. He said, the bad news is we don't have any money. Some things in RTE just never change. So I said, that's fine. He said, look, we might get the money. We're trying to get the budget. If we do, I'll get back to you. So a number of months passed, second phone call. There's good news and there's bad news. Well, I said, what's that? He said, well, the good news is you, and there's a couple of others as well, you've got the job. I said, that's great. And the bad news is we've been told we can't hire you by the higher-ups in RTE because you are a pirate. So you can obviously imagine I was pretty crushed by this piece of information. But Leo did me a great favour. He recommended me to somebody he knew in the BBC in Belfast, in Radio Ulster. And I was approached by them, and to cut a long story short, I got a job in Belfast, and off I went. And after about 6 months, I got a further phone call from Leo to say, we've got a vacancy, and we're wondering, would you be interested in putting your hat in the ring? And I said, Leo, I thought I was blacklisted because I was a pirate. Oh, he said, don't worry about that. You've been laundered by the BBC. I said, well, Leo, I'll think about it. I thought about it, and I stayed put. And I stayed in the BBC in Belfast for 3 years, and it was 3 fantastic years. I didn't study journalism. I wasn't in any journalism school or any college. But I really got my grounding in the BBC in those 3 or 4 years.
Which of course set you in good stead, because there's so many huge stories over the years that you have brought to people here.
So, yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking Good Friday Agreement, Mary Robinson's election, Obama, 9/11.
Yeah.
It's, and you were broadcasting live on that day.
On the day of 9/11, yes. I was in, I mean, I think that's one of those occasions we all remember where we were when the news came through about the planes hitting the Twin Towers. And I was in town. I was in the centre of Dublin having some lunch. And I was making my way around to government buildings because I was to interview a man called Richard Haas, who was an American diplomat who'd been appointed by George Bush to be the envoy to Ireland. He was the George Mitchell, if you like, of the Bush administration. So I met somebody on the street who said, there's something about a plane that's hit the Trade Center in New York. I said, oh, this is before mobile phones. We didn't have instant news. So having this half scrap of information, I went round to government buildings. All the press were there. Richard Haas was there. The Taoiseach, who was Bertie Ahern at the time, was there. And of course, the word had come through and everything was cancelled. There were no interviews. They both made brief statements and I headed back out here to RTE. And RTE had gone on air, the television had gone on air with one of my colleagues, Anthony Murnane, who was a young reporter at the time, a young presenter. He's now one of our senior editors. He was my editor on the 6-1 for many years. And Anthony had got on air and I arrived in the studio and I went on with him. And between him and me and others going backwards and forwards, I was on the air from about 3 o'clock in the afternoon until I think 10 o'clock that night.
And you were covering the story here, and there was a certain Charlie Bird who had managed to get himself into New York.
Not on that day. It took him a couple of days
to get in.
He was. I think he was in Mexico for some reason, and he managed to get to the border and somehow or other persuaded the Americans to let him in. And he made his way overland, I think, because all the flights were grounded. Do you remember that? And he got to New York. But it was an extraordinary day. Two things I particularly remember. Conor O'Cleary, who was an Irish Times correspondent in New York at the time, and he had an apartment in Lower Manhattan, and he had a clear view of the buildings. So he saw it all happening. And at one stage, we had him on the air, on a phone line, describing people jumping from the buildings. You remember that? And it was a really chilling moment. And the other thing that really is a memory that abides with me is a shot we saw of all the ambulances lined up, ready to take away the injured. But there were no injured. There were no casualties.
You know, when you cover stuff like that, it's particularly hard. I know you were very good friends with Charlie, and when someone like Charlie, who's a friend of yours, becomes a news story, that must have been difficult too for you.
Yeah, Charlie was a great battler. He was a tremendous fighter, you know, I was on air the day the word came through that he passed away, and we were all just devastated, because we know what a struggle and a battle he'd put up, and that he'd survived, I suppose, really against the odds. For quite some time, and we had the lady in from the Motor Neuron Disease Association, and Charlie worked very closely with Motor Neuron Disease Ireland, and promoted them and raised funds for them. And she was telling me this, and then she said something else. You know, Charlie had his little computer where his voice was able to be replicated, and she said that software actually has been developed and advanced in recent years. In leaps and bounds, but people with motor neuron disease who are affected by their speech is affected, she said they haven't liked to use it. They feel it's embarrassing. They are reluctant to adopt this technology. And she said, Charlie made it acceptable. And that was the moment that I choked up. And fortunately, I think she could see it and she kept talking, because it took me just a couple of beats to get back. I thought the power of that sort of positive influence that you can have on people's lives, it's great credit to him.
You have a lot of friends in here tonight. As you can hear, we have some that work with you. We have David McCulla here. There's David. How are you getting on?
Good, thanks, Patrick.
What's your memories of working with this fella?
Just so many memories over the years. I've been employed in RTE for 30 years, slight difference probably. And all of that time, Bryan has just been a paragon, setting the standard for the rest of us. I particularly remember, Bryan, the radio report you did from the South African elections. Do you remember that day, for the Sunday, and the bomb went off? And Bryan, at very short notice, put together this fantastic radio package. The sound of broken glass as you were walking across, just reading your link. It was just really brought it home to you. And Bryan has this great way of being, as you all know, incredibly polite, but also asking the really hard question. And I don't know how many times I've seen people being interviewed by Bryan and coming away thinking, what a nice man, and not realising that they've been eviscerated live on air, which is great, great for the listener. And, Bryan has this talent that you could parachute him anywhere in the world. Drop him by parachute, give him 5 minutes, and he will present the news for you. He will be immaculately dressed, not a hair out of place, and completely on top of the subject, whether it's Good Friday Agreement, papal funeral, American election or whatever. And he makes it look easy, which for those of us who are somewhat less talented is partly inspirational and partly really, really annoying because he set the bar so high. And even now, if I'm doing an outside broadcast and you might look for something and they'll look at you with a look of disappointment and say, well, Dobbo never needed an auto cue, and Dobbo never needed a PC, and Dobbo never needed an umbrella. So we struggle on. But Bryan set high standards, and he was particular about how things were done, and particular about who should appear on the 6-1 news. And I remember one occasion when I was a political correspondent, I was about to do a live at the top of the 6-1 from outside government buildings, and I noticed out of the corner of my eye this fella dressed in a panda suit. And I thought, I don't like the look of that. So I got onto the talkback and I said, folks, just to let you know, we might be joined by a panda. And I could hear Dobbo in studio going, a panda? We can't have a panda on the 6-1. I said, well, what am I supposed to do? Well, go and get the cops. So anyway, I asked somebody to have a word with our friend. And the last thing I saw before I went on air was him taking off his panda head and tucking it under his arm and trudging off down towards Merrion Square. So the 6-1 was saved.
And we have that panda here tonight. I know, Anne Casson, you have known this man for a very, very long time. You went to college together.
That's
he was dapper even then.
Well, I have to say, Paddy, that certainly Bryan cut a dash even in the awful early 80s when the rest of us were tramping around in desert boots and donkey jackets and duffel coats. Bryan and I were in College of Commerce in Rathmines doing communications. Bryan's quite right, didn't do journalism, but we were in the communications course, along with people like Theresa Mannion, RTE's regional reporter. And even then, Bryan had style and dash about him. And I do recall possibly one of our first meetings ever, Bryan, you did arrive with a briefcase and your jacket and your corduroy trousers, always composed, a great friend and a great colleague. And you referred to Pirate Radio earlier on, the early stages of your career and being blacklisted, but I have to say that I owe one of my breaks in broadcasting to Bryan, because it was Ireland in the 80s. It was awful. There were no jobs, and I wanted to get into broadcasting as well, and there were no jobs in broadcasting. Bryan said to me one day, he was working doing news and current affairs in Radio Nova, and he said, you know what, they need somebody in the morning to write the scripts for Bob Gallico, who was the newsreader at the time. You know, there's a slot there. You might come along and interview. So anyway, I did. I was interviewed by Sybil Fennell, and I got the job. And really, that was the start of my journey on my broadcasting career. And I just want to say, Bryan's been a great friend and a great colleague over the years. And thanks, Bryan.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
The news has changed an awful lot since you started. We now have real news. We now have fake news. Is now a good time to be getting out of the real news because of the fake news?
No, I'd encourage anybody who's thinking of going into journalism to stick with it. It's a tough enough business to make your way in, and the challenges are very different now. As you say, there's a whole lot more going on social media that didn't exist in my time. We mentioned 9/11. There was a couple of shots of what happened that day and very little else, because there was no mobile phones or anything like that. And it is very alarming what's happening, in relation to fake news and to AI, which really seems to terrifies me, the prospects for creating misinformation and for distorting truth. But I think people who want the truth will start to look more and more at the source of the news that they're consuming. Now, they might consume it on their phone or it might be on a laptop or on radio or television, but I think they'll ask more and more, where is this coming from? Who's behind it? Who's putting it together? And I think that that's the strength that RTE and other broadcasters here in the Virgin and News Talk and the commercial stations as well and others across the UK and Europe. I think that's going to become increasingly a strength for organisations like ours. So I'd be optimistic about the future.
You're optimistic. We talk about being optimistic. I mean, some of the last bulletins that you reported on, you know, bomb threats outside politicians' houses here in Ireland and migrants being moved on and, you know, clashes with protesters in Gardaí. Do you think the news that you're reporting on at the end of your career here in Ireland has become worse?
Well, the country has changed immeasurably in the 40 years that I've been in journalism, and for the most part changed for the better. I mean, Anne talked about the 1980s. It was a very grim decade. Mass unemployment, mass migration, huge interest rates, the violence in the north, the backdrop for people on this side of the border of all that, and battles over divorce and contraception and all that which we're very familiar with, and really no money, no resources to tackle the problems that the country faced. So we have a lot of problems today. Housing is the one. Housing really is where it's at. And we have the resources to be able to tackle this. We have the money. We're a wealthy nation. Now, I'm not saying people are wealthy, but as a nation, we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So we can sort these problems out. And I think, I think if we have the determination and that we can put in place the plans, we can really create a much better future for I have a grandson now, and you know, my hope is that he grows up in a country where there's opportunity, exactly, Miles, where there's opportunity, where he can work and he can live, and in due course, if he wants to, he can raise a family as well. I think we can do that.
We've got some of the family in the audience. We've got your wife, Kriya. Kriya, you're looking forward to spend a bit more time with this man?
I am, of course. Yeah, absolutely. I think we're both looking forward to spending extra time, more time on our hands, more time to do the things we want to do. Maybe some of those, you know, midweek deals you get. So yes, definitely we are.
I know we've also got Hannah and Sophie as well. Hannah, talk to us a little bit about this man's interviewing skills when it came to some of the fellas that used to turn up at the house.
Well, as a journalist, of course, his interview skills are kind of ingrained in him. So growing up, we would come home from school and he'd say, or he wouldn't just say, like, how was your day, and move on, like many other parents would do. He would say, how's your day? And what was your favourite class? And why was that your favourite class? And what did you learn in that class? And why was that as interesting? And really dig down deep into it. So that went on for years and years and years, to the point where me and Sophie would get so fed up with it and we'd say, Dad, stop interviewing us. So I think by the time we brought our now partners home and introduced them to Dad, Dad was so scared of getting in trouble for interviewing that he was like the quietest we've ever seen him.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You see? Don't frighten the boyfriends. You know.
I don't think you can ever frighten the boyfriends enough. So look, what are you going to miss most before we let you go?
Oh, what am I going to miss most? I'm going to miss the people I work with, yeah. I mean, in terms of RTE, yes, that's what I'm going to miss. No question about it.
What we're going to miss is you doing what you do. This is Bryan at his best.
Just leave it rolling, I'll give it again. And to report on this year's National Management Conference.
For millions of black South Africans, the moment they have waited for has almost arrived.
Good evening and welcome to 6-1 from Manger Square in Bethlehem. I don't know what we're doing, where we're going. Well, I think the focus in the days and weeks ahead will be very much on David Trimble.
Hijacked aircraft crash into the World Trade Center in Manhattan in New York.
Did you have any qualms about taking this money? Senator Barack Obama has made history to become the 44th President of the United States of America.
The Queen touched down at Casement Aerodrome at Baldonnel a little before 12 o'clock.
The people of the United Kingdom have voted to leave the European Union. We haven't given up yet.
I hate to go, but I'm afraid I have to leave.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you and good night.
Good night, Papa.
Just at the end there. That was Miles at the end.
Thank you.
Bryan,
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind.
Bryan, I know that this is not your thing, sitting here and...
Ask the questions.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, I know that you got into this job, you know, for two reasons, to give us the news and to tell the truth. And the truth is tonight, as you can hear, that there are so many people in this audience, so many people in this building, and so many people across this country who are going to miss you. They're going to miss who you are and what you stand for. And on behalf of everybody tonight, I would just like to say thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bryan Dobson! Okay.